Hello, this is Head to Head on UATV, and I'm Oles Gerjuk. Yet another strongly worded statement from Hungary and Ukraine. Officially, Hungary does not mind Ukraine's participation in the upcoming NATO Summit with Ukraine and Georgia, but continues to officially block a bilateral NATO-Ukraine summit. So how will this situation develop further, and how does it reflect on Ukraine? To talk about this, we welcome to the studio Andreas Umland, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Euro-Atlantic Cooperation. Hello, and thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
So Hungary is hindering the development of Ukraine-NATO relations, basically over the language provisions of Ukraine's new educational law, which is popularizing the use of Ukrainian language in schools. What is your take on that?
Well, there are basically two interpretations which do not contradict each other. The first one, and I think the most obvious one, is that Hungary has now a relatively nationalist government which tries to push its policies domestically and in the foreign sphere, and it's using its leverage over the NATO-Ukrainian relationship to secure its interest as it understands it within Ukraine, and namely to push for continued Hungarian language education in Ukraine. A more sinister interpretation would be that there could be some Russian involvement here, that there are connections between Hungary and Russia, although I would not overemphasize this. I think Russia is in a way benefiting from this tension between NATO and Ukraine because of Hungary, but there's obviously here some, at least I would say, some parallelity in the Hungarian and Russian interests. But I wouldn't be too conspirological about it. But I think it needs to be said to the Hungarian government and to the Hungarian people that Russia is the main benefactor of these tensions between NATO and Ukraine.
What are your thoughts on how could we get out of this difficult situation?
Well, I think it's partly also a result of perhaps an insufficient Ukrainian diplomatic preparation of this new law. Maybe there should have been more consultations before. I think now the way to go is to have these consultations as they are now already happening. I think there was just a couple of days ago a meeting in Lviv concerning this between a Ukrainian and Hungarian consultation. But I think this whole issue once more illustrates for Ukraine that it is not sufficient to have good relations with the large partners in the West, with the US, with Germany or with Britain, but the small member countries of both NATO and the EU also demand attention. And I think I feel that sometimes when I'm in Central Eastern Europe, that some of the diplomats and experts and politicians in Central Eastern Europe, they feel that that Ukraine should pay more attention to them and should not just develop good relations with, let's say, Germany.
What is so problematic about the law? I mean, the law is promoting the use of Ukrainian language in schools, but it doesn't forbid the use of some other language of national minorities which are living in Ukraine. Basically, these people who are living in Ukraine using different language, they would study also Ukrainian, so then they can have some future in Ukraine. Otherwise, they're not able to speak the official language in this country.
Well, I'm clearly on the Ukrainian side in this quarrel, but you have to understand that from a nationalistic point of view, of course, you would push for as much Hungarian language use as possible, and that's just the current ideology, basically, of the Fidesz government. And before the new law, there was I would say, over-liberal handling of this issue. You could have your entire, as far as I know, your entire education in Hungarian in Ukrainian state school, and this is now going to be changed. So what we had before was, in fact, in a way, an absurd situation that one could fully get a full school education in a governmental school in Ukraine in Hungarian. This is now changing, and in fact, it's still relatively liberal. But for a Hungarian nationalist, of course, this will always be insufficient, and that is just how things go. And I think that's also a larger lesson for Ukraine in its relations with NATO, that it will not be easy for Ukraine to have a closer relationship or even to enter NATO, because there are these various small countries that have veto powers, and Hungary is by far not, I would say, the most pro-Russian country in NATO. There are others: Greece, Italy, Bulgaria. And that also means that there will be in the future as well problems between NATO and Ukraine, and especially I think there's no prospect yet for Ukraine to enter NATO because of these pro-Russian countries.
Well, we still have to go some paths to fully comply with the NATO standards in the Ukrainian defense sector and army. Well, we have this deadline until 2020, but this scandalous environment is lasting already since last September, and even after this long hiatus, the ministers of foreign affairs of Ukraine and Hungary, two counterparts, Pavlo Klimkin and Peter Szijarto, they have recently met. So what solutions did they come to, and could we expect some change in the dialogue?
Well, as far as I understand, there is already an offer from Ukraine to apply this new education law in a different way with regard to languages of the European Union, and Hungarian is a language of the European Union. And I think it shouldn't be that difficult, actually, to find some sort of compromise. But Hungary will be pushing for as much as it can get, and it's using its leverage. That's the sad story of this development. Hungary has, of course, many other problems within the European Union and also within NATO, and this is just one of the side problems, I would say.
So basically, the only way for Ukraine in this situation is basically keep dealing with Hungary, because they're not going to come down, basically.
Yes, I'm afraid that that is the only way to go. I mean, there is also obviously here another method to deal with it, namely to explain the situation in Brussels to the NATO headquarters, to explain it in Washington, and then to have maybe certain major Western powers on one side. But for that, it would have to outline, I think, Ukraine would have to outline in a very sophisticated way that the Hungarian interests are actually taken care of, and that Hungary is here pushing for an unreasonable modification of the Ukrainian education law.
Well, actually, on the second week of July, Brussels is hosting a NATO Summit. Mm-hmm. What are your expectations?
I'm afraid, that nothing really substantial will come out of it. I think at the end of the day, the only real question here is about a membership perspective, a membership action plan
for Ukraine and Georgia.
Yes, and although we have this declaration from 2008, the Bucharest Declaration, which says that Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO, I'm afraid this will not go forward as long as these countries have their territorial conflicts with Russia. The absurd situation in which Ukraine and Georgia find themselves today, that I'm afraid they will only become NATO members when they will not need it that much anymore, when the conflict basically with Russia will be resolved. Only then will there be a consensus within NATO, and all of the member countries of NATO would have to agree to a new accession.
What are your thoughts? How can Ukraine end this conflict with Russia?
Well, I think for now there's very little that Ukraine can do. I think what it can do is to develop domestically and to become domestically as strong as possible. It should certainly develop its relations with NATO as far as it can sort of before membership. But I think Ukraine also needs to think about other formats of other alliances, coalitions, of security assurances, maybe even security guarantees. There are other ways to approach this. For instance, there was the so-called Adriatic Charter, which is still there, which is an alliance between the Balkan countries and the US. There was the Baltic Charter. There is the intermarium idea. There are the relationships between Ukraine and Turkey. So there are various other formats into which Ukraine would have to look more carefully.
So Ukraine should more rely on international pressure. That's what you mean?
Yes, I mean, Ukraine will never be a military match to the Russian Federation, unfortunately. So it needs to build alliances. And against the background that a full membership of Ukraine in NATO is not in the immediate future possible, it needs to find and to build other alliances.
Well, thank you so much for your interesting opinion.
Thank you for having me.
That was Andreas Umland, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Euro-Atlantic Cooperation. Thank you for watching Head to Head. I'm Andreas Umland. Goodbye.